Hungarian-born László Kondor has, for decades, been best known as a conflict and political photographer. This masterly body of vintage photographs of Chicago's public art and architecture from the 1960s through to the 1980s was a non-commissioned personal project. Kondor arrived in Chicago from Central Europe in 1961 and became immediately awe-inspired by the unfamiliar yet extraordinary architecture of the city, which is the birthplace of the modern skyscraper. Kondor prowled amongst the landmarks created by legends from the world of international and modern architecture. Giants such as Mies van der Rohe, Helmut Jahn, and Skidmore, Owings and Merrill created in Kondor's eyes a magical forest of metal and glass, which sparked in him an insatiable and addictive artistic appetite. Kondor returned to his subjects again and again, hungry for the perfect visual conditions within which he could create his art. This pilgrimage became a journey of discovery. Here, László Kondor discusses several of his favorite photographs from his collection.
It might be interesting to Hungarian audiences viewing these photographs of Chicago that in the late 19th century, Chicago and Budapest were the two fastest growing cities in the world. Chicago grew fast because they totally burned down in 1870. The Budapest Road started after the kiegyezés, the big treaty, a peace treaty between Austria and Hungary. And both cities, from virtually nothing, they grew up at an incredible speed. The end result of it was different, the outcome was different, but that's an interesting footnote to history. But when I arrived to Chicago, to me what was really interesting and fascinating were what you call the tall building, the skyscrapers, the modern architecture of the city. Coming from Europe, I was used to Gothic, Renaissance, and the great architectural styles of the past. To me, the exciting thing, coming from Central Europe, from Hungary, was to see these gigantic buildings. You know, at first, they were intimidating, and you had to kind of walk around and get used to them. But then, piece by slowly, you made friends with them. This exhibit really, the early sets of photographs were done by me in the middle 1960s. The second part came in the late 80s and 90s when I returned from my tour in Vietnam. So they're quite separate from each other. I also use different technique. Well, in the beginning, I used a Nikon or a Leica camera, a 35mm camera. In a second set in the 1980s and 90s, I used a Hasselblad camera, which of course much larger, gives you a much larger negative and a whole different flexibility. This first photograph is the topping off of the Sears Tower in 1972. This was at that time when it was completed. It was the tallest building in Chicago, 100-story tall, and the tallest building in the world for about 20 years. Still, other buildings around the world became even larger. This was right on the top of the building on the outside. It was quite an experience. Chicago is not made up only out of skyscrapers. As a matter of fact, a large part of the city is very modest 2 to 3-story buildings. This is a photograph here to show. This is Milwaukee Avenue, one of the few streets in Chicago that is not in criss-cross section, but diagonally go to the city. Quite unique for Chicago for that reason. And there you can see virtually on the horizon the skyscrapers. This is the Sears Tower building of the completion, photograph from the Illinois University campus, just south of the downtown area of Chicago. Here, I'm returning to the Sears Tower 25 years later with a different camera, with a Hasselblad. And here I was fascinated. In that time period, in the 30-year period, a lot of additional skyscrapers were built. And what was interesting to me, that these enormous, huge pane glass buildings actually paid a whimsical reflection and interaction with the already existing building. I needed that 20 years period to this glass, wonderful glass skyscrapers to be built to do that. This is actually, you want to say, it's a little cheating here, because this is a reflection plus a double exposure. This is the Hasselblad camera made that technique interesting and intriguing for me to use. Here we are going back to one of the early period of the middle 1960s. We're viewing the Marina Tower. Actually, there is two towers identical in size and shape. This is not a glass and steel building. This was actually a poured concrete building. At that time, not merely the tallest, one of the tallest building in Chicago, but uniquely that it was completely poured concrete structuring. The idea was here, with these twin towers, the buildings are right on the Chicago River, and the concept was was very interesting architecturally and, if you want to say, sociologically. On the very lowest level, there was a boat harbor, really, for boats to come in to tie up at the building. With the large circles on the base, what you see is the garages, and above, the apartments going up to 60-story high. The concept was living in a city, return to live in a city. Because after the war, baby boom generation and superhighways, the city of Chicago lost, like many other cities, lost a large percentage of their population. They moved to the suburbs. There was nothing wrong with it, except they took their money with them, the tax that supported the city itself. So there was in many cities at that time, a major effort to bring back the money, the tax base that sustains the services to the cities. So that was a reaching out program to make urban living exciting and sexy again. This is just another view, the Marina Tower, from one building to another, just a completely different view. And actually, the Chicagoans at that time, kind of whimsically, they refer to the two buildings as the corn cobs, because they kind of have the shapes and configuration of a corn cob. On this view, it's again going back, jumping again to the 1980s, because in the meanwhile, after the 15-year period, an additional building was built next to the Marina Towers, a Miss Vendero-esque glass and steel construction. And again, I enjoy showing the reflection of the Marina Tower and contrasting the two different architectural styles in one photograph, one frame. Here again, we are jumping a little bit back and forth from the late 1960s. The First National Bank, which of course later on was sold and renamed the Chase Manhattan Bank. In front of it is a segment of a very large mosaic created by the famous artist Marc Chagall. We can see again the view where First National Bank building, or the Chase Manhattan, reflected in a building that was built 15 years later. This is the Xerox building, which is a perfect kind of mirror, a mirroring device for the both buildings. Here, combining, again, using the Hasselblad, the larger format camera. On the right is the First National. On the left, reflecting it back, is the Xerox building. And the black silhouetting frame is the building of the U.S. Steel, which were built in a later phase. Here is, again, going back to a little in the late 60s or early 80s, I'm not exactly sure. On the left, right on shore of Michigan Lake, is the Miss Vendero Lake Point Tower building, which is an apartment complex. And the right, with a very strong, powerful vertical lines, is the Standard Oil building of Indiana. And it was just an interesting way to visually to bring the two very different structures in contrast with each other. This is again still a closer up look on Lake Point Tower. It's a little distorted because that a square image there is really much, much smaller. That's the garage structure, and the tower on top of it catching just the sunlight during the days. And here we have a more close-up view of the John Hancock building, which is still called the John Hancock, with on the right the adjacent garage structure. Again, this was the architectural and sociological concept to build a city in a city that you had provided every service that an urban person would need. It's another form of enticement to bring back a lot of people, young and professional people from the suburbs for urban living. They really had to, the builders and the city really had to plan for it. First floor, there was always a 2-3 story apartment retail stores, and then above it another 10-15 story maybe offices, and above it apartments. These buildings normally, usually, contain swimming pools, laundry facilities, and exercise rooms. So in that image, you see the wisest skyscraper called skyscrapers because it reaches into the clouds. I lived in this building on the 82nd floor, and that was interesting, but sometimes you wake up in the morning, and you have to call down to the doorman to ask, John, do I need umbrella today? Because I didn't know if it was raining down there or not. And then he just simply said, umbrella there, sir. This was actually the John Hancock, or the Big John as Chicagoans to this day like to call it, was a building designed by Skidmore, Owen and Merrill, one of the largest architectural firms of Chicago. And there the Pakistani board engineer, Mr. Khan, came up with the concept that you can build actually up to a kilometer tall skyscraper using a certain structure. And the building technique to it was very simple. You have to dig up deep. In Chicago you had to, because we are not like New York, in Manhattan that sits on granite. You have to put in the deep caissons in the ground, fill it up with steel and concrete, and you have 6 or 8 major steel structures set in concrete to hold the whole structure in a various progression. And the Sears Tower is built exactly the same way, except the shaping is different. But today you go to Dubai and you see the Khalif building, also designed by Skidmore, Owen and Merrill. They are busy all over the world. There you can see on the outside how progressively it gets thinner as you go up. But theoretically, this kind of a structural solution makes possible to build buildings a kilometer or a mile high. Sometimes when I went into commercial photography later, and I used my work for fashion and advertising, the buildings as a backdrop. I was by that time quite familiar with them. And this is just another fashion image from one of the famous Chicago buildings, the Rookery.